All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Making the Argument. Well, unless you've been hiding in a cave somewhere, and perhaps even then, you've known that big tech has had a bit of a problem with, people that don't walk the party line. And in fact, we have all kinds of evidence that has now been showing that the government has been colluding with big tech. In fact, in some cases, you might even say intimidating big tech to censor voices or to censor information that it finds inconvenient. Well, today with us on the show, we have Andrew Riddaugh, who worked in the Trump White House and is also the CEO and co-founder of Liberation Technology Services. And Andrew got to see a lot of this from the front lines. I mean, imagine working in the White House and just watching as all of a sudden, all of these big tech companies, and keep in mind, it wasn't just the stuff you saw on like Twitter back in the day or YouTube or Facebook or Meta. It wasn't just that. We actually saw like Google servers completely shutting down Parler and preventing it from being able to operate as soon as it was starting to pick up steam. So this is a very real issue in the way that government works with big tech in order to, let's just say, censor the people they don't like. Not to mention that with the latest issue with Crowdstrike, I think people all over the world realize just how fragile at times this system that we have is. And so, Andrew, thank you very much for joining us.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
So, Andrew, real quick, give us a little bit of background on what exactly you did with the Trump administration and working in the White House.
So I was there all 4 years. So as you can imagine, served in a variety of different roles. But for the last 2.5 years or so, I was one of the senior advance leads for the President Trump. And what that essentially means is we would go out days to even a couple of weeks ahead of time to set up these events that the president would participate in, whether it's, him going to one of his properties for a holiday, to a rally, a policy event, or going into North Korea. There were 4 of us that ensured that every time the president attended an event, that it not only represented, him and the best image possible, but the America First values, the administration, and many times the United States as a whole.
Well, how did you do? Real quick, I just got to dig into this a little bit. The North Korea trip. I remember when that was first, when the president was first talking about doing that, and I was a little bit skeptical, right? I was skeptical, and my background was I was a Green Beret. I worked in counterinsurgency, unconventional warfare, and one of the things that we were always concerned about is giving legitimacy to certain regimes. But the other thing that we were actually very adept at is understanding that you've got to work with people, especially if you want to avoid a larger conflict. And I think Trump was the first president that really tried to establish some sort of open communications with North Korea for the purpose of de-escalating the situation, for the purpose of preventing wars. But that trip was not just historic. It had to be a logistical and security nightmare. I mean, without going into details that you can't share, what were some of the challenges associated with that?
Well, first off, when President Trump tweeted that out, that was the first time that this was really ever on the schedule. This wasn't some kind of secret planned thing. As an advance lead, you plan for every scenario. So teams on the ground already had a hypothetical course of action if he wanted to do that. Obviously, we've also met and worked with the North Korean delegation on the 2 previous trips. The first one in Singapore, we were on the ground for almost 3 weeks, 2 of those weeks working to a degree with the North Koreans, and then obviously in Vietnam. And, one of the interesting things that we kind of gained out of that is, for the Singapore trip, they more or less gave us carte blanche approval rights. And because they admitted and realized that President Trump puts on major events like this all the time. And they realized that the team on the ground was there to produce a safe and effective, but also well polished and published event. And so, going into that later trip, it's crazy, but, there was at least a little bit of experience working together. And so, the teams on the ground are able to say, okay, look, we didn't know about this, you didn't know about this. Let's try to come together in a significantly shorter amount of time than in trips past to put together a event that can at least try to move this conversation forward. Well, and I think ultimately that's what you see.
No, I think it was. I mean, I'm thinking about the job that you had, and it had to be like, you know, two parts exciting and at least one part terrifying because you didn't know where you're going next based off of, like you said, and that's kind of the Trump style, right? He's a CEO, he's a boss. He's not sitting there waiting for 13 different committees to approve on something. He has an idea, he wants to do it, and then he surrounds himself with people that can actually make sure it gets done.
Well, and more differently, in I would say stark comparison to this administration, he's the one calling the shots compared to, under the Biden administration, where it's the staff that are really running the show.
Yeah.
And so, President Trump woke up and said, we're so close. I want to continue the conversation. And that's exactly what he did.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I do want to get that point you made about the staff running the show and the bureaucracy running the show. I really want to dig into that because one of the things I don't think a lot of people have a sound appreciation for is they have this idea that when the president gets elected, well, he's the chief executive, right? He runs the executive branch. And people do not fully appreciate how little control their president actually has over the executive branch. That's not to say they don't have any, but what is it, like 3,000 appointments? But other than that, you have this entire bureaucracy, massive amounts, millions of people that are essentially covered by civil service laws and are almost impossible to fire, even if they are there slow rolling or directly opposing or at every opportunity, obstructing the president's agenda. And Trump was, I think, one of the first presidents that I've seen in my lifetime that truly understood the nature of this problem and started working on ways to actually, combat that, and in a way that was very relevant and oftentimes very creative. I've spoken to other people of former Trump staff and whatnot that had to contend with this. But since you were in a job that focused so much on, again, the advance parties for these large events, the communications between the White House and with the president that, quite frankly, probably ran more of his own communications through Twitter than anybody. What was it like watching as that progression and kind of where did you start to see that change where we expected a hostile press, right? Like you didn't go in there thinking, oh, we're going to have a honeymoon phase with CNN, right? Like you knew they were gunning for you from the very, very beginning. But again, when was that change when all of a sudden it wasn't just the typical, far left press doing far left things, but now all of a sudden it was moving more into that realm of censorship? When did you start to notice that?
Well, so I think everyone was aware, at least to some degree, that the media technology companies were never giving the President Trump or really conservatives a fair shake as far as coverage and narrative go. And that was kind of painfully obvious from day one of the administration. But then, and that's exactly why he used Twitter, because it was a way for him to communicate directly with the American people without, a media outlet putting their opinion, their spin, or taking a 30-second soundbite of an hour and a half long speech to craft their narrative. And so he would use Twitter to communicate directly to the American people, and I think very effectively in most cases. Now, as we moved into, the 2020 election, that's where I think we saw technology companies kind of stepping from behind the curtain. We always knew that those out in Silicon Valley had an inherent bias. They were overwhelmingly Democrat. They donated heavily to the DNC and the Democratic machine. But then as we were getting closer, you kind of see them taking a more forward and overt kind of position, whether it's taking down Parler, deplatforming conservative outlets. They were essentially a fourth branch, an additional campaign tool to the Biden administration. And, the revelations that came out of the Twitter files, which, Musk made available for the American people, I think highlighted just how closely the Biden campaign and then ultimately the Biden administration was working with these different technology companies to control the exact narrative.
So let's go into that for a second, because that's a good point, right? Like it's this idea that the Biden campaign, but it wasn't just the Biden campaign, right? You had elements of the Department of Justice, you had elements within the intelligence community, you had elements within the federal government that ostensibly were supposed to be operating under, I mean, obviously they have constitutional responsibilities and they're not supposed to follow unlawful orders, but the commander-in-chief was Donald Trump, not Joe Biden. So a lot of people look at this going, well, what are you talking about? This was during the Trump administration. Go into a little bit of like this idea that you actually had members of the federal bureaucracy that were working with, and again, from what we've seen in the Twitter files, you even see places where what was it, Dempsey and Zuckerberg and whatnot, they're even kind of pushing back a little bit like, hey, look, we don't like the guy, but this is not how we're supposed to operate.
Yeah.
And there was almost this sense of, the government not necessarily overtly coming out and saying, you will take this down, but it was more like, sure would be a shame if this Russian collusion or this Russian propaganda didn't get taken down off your site. And then you're listening to people like, Congress and senators, Democrat Congress and senators, like, yeah, sure would be a shame if we had to come in and maybe, I don't know, investigate you for antitrust, or like, is that how they got around doing it? Is that how they got around essentially subverting the sitting president and using the apparatus that he's supposed to be in charge of to actually collude with Twitter and Meta?
Yeah, so I think that it goes to a bigger scope of how the government works, right? Now, mind you, President Trump had some executive orders in place that he was going to enact in the second term and hopefully still will enact, which removes a lot of the protection for the federal employees and puts them more on merit-based review instead of tenure. Because how the federal government works, as you were kind of talking about earlier, there's presidential appointees and appointments into the different agencies, but then there's about 3 times as many what are called careers. And those are individuals that, will stay on throughout administration. And I would say a lot of them have great intentions. They're there for the right reasons, but there are also an overwhelming majority, number of former Democratic appointees from, say, the Obama administration, then transfer into being a career and then almost act as a subversive agent for the Democratic Party. They would actively stonewall us. But at the same time, there were even, conservative appointments under the Trump administration, at the upper senior and mid-level staffers that were openly saying, hey, we don't like the Trump admin. We are joining the Trump admin to basically be a block against it, to work against the administration as a whole. And unfortunately, there were so many individuals that even with the president and the appointees that were there for, the right reasons, it's such a big organization that you don't necessarily have complete oversight. And then also you add on the fact that Section 230 really protects a lot of these technology companies. And, there's very little backlash for them, enacting and infringing on, say, the First Amendment right of, businesses and U.S. citizens.
That's a good point, but I want to get serious for a moment. We all know that Jeremy's Razors creates one of the greatest blades ever known to man. As I've stated before, exclusively constructed out of roundhouse kicks by Chuck Norris, so it'll cut through anything, including even this when appropriate. But as you can see, I like to wear a beard. Doesn't mean I still don't have to trim up around other areas of the face in order to keep it nice just the way Tina likes it. But when I have this beard, I need to make sure it's also well-groomed and taken care of. And now with Jeremy's Razors Beard Kit, I can do just that. Because it comes with oil, balm, a brush, shampoo, everything I need to make sure that this particular man coat is taken care of the way it deserves to be and the way that Tina demands. Now, if you have your own lady in your life that wants to make sure that the beard that you display is worthy of her, I highly recommend you go to jeremysrazors.com and use promo code Nick, or we've made it easy for you. Just go to the link in the description. Put in Nick, and you're going to get 15% off your order because that's how we do around here. That's right. Support free market capitalism, support Jeremy's Razors, and support this show by looking incredible. Jeremy'sRazors.com, promo code Nick, or just go to the link in the description. Get 15% off today, and we'll see you looking fabulous shortly. Let me ask you a question, that because obviously, like I'm a state legislator. And one of the things that we always contend with is the idea that you can look at a problem and you can easily identify a problem and you can easily identify what you want to stop happening. But the moment you start writing it into code, all of a sudden you start picking up all kinds of unintended consequences, right? Ways that it can be applied that are completely outside of your intent. Now, I've looked at like Section 230, and I've kind of looked at it from the standpoint of, look, this is supposed to be a publisher platform distinction. And, again, the platform model is the phone company, right? They don't necessarily monitor what I say, nor do they censor what I say on the phone. So I could be saying horrible things on the phone, right? And it's not their obligation because they're just providing a platform. It's like when Ford sells me a car, they're not responsible for how I drive it. They're just providing the platform, which is the car. But what we saw with Twitter and Meta and the rest is they're like, oh, no, we're a platform, but then we're going to come up with these community guidance standards. And the problem was not community standards, right? The problem was not a private company with a platform saying, hey, you can't be on this platform using it to, conduct illegal activities or to suggest, illegal activities. It was whatever we consider hateful. And that's where we got into this realm of, well, now you've essentially told a large private company with an incredible amount of power that they can essentially change the conditions for which they operate with the public and with their customers as a platform, and now they can operate as a publisher because that's effectively what they're doing. What do you see? What do you see as a potential maybe fix within 230 language that doesn't create a situation? Because I always look at it, it's like, okay, we might reform 230, and that's all we're trying to get at is you don't get to be a publisher if you're operating as a platform. But what I'm always aware of is, okay, great, until you have a Democrat attorney general or until you have a Democrat, district attorney, until you have somebody in the federal government that decides they want to engage in a kind of lawfare or intimidation against these companies. And now whatever changes you've made, they found broad enough language to turn it into something you never intended. And now you're the author of the very censorship you were trying to prevent. So do you see some sort of solution within 230 where we can get to the sort of censorship that was problematic without creating whole new powers within the federal government to come in and dictate what a private company can or cannot let you do within their platform?
Right. So I think that it's kind of multifold. So to what you're talking about, as far as, it being so broad that a attorney general can manipulate the, information, the Chevron ruling that the Supreme Court just came down on, I think will help really force legislators to clearly define what they mean, what is in and what is out.
Definitely.
Basically, for your listeners, the Chevron decision said is, agencies in different levels of the government can't just interpret very broadly written legislation and kind of make their own policy out of it. So it forces not only a restriction on the executive branch and the departments and agencies, but it also puts a requirement on the legislators to write clear and articulatable pieces of legislation that, you can understand one way or another what the intention was.
Chevron, the original Chevron decision was probably one of the worst Supreme Court decisions we've had in the last 50 years. I mean, it gave so much power to the federal government because it essentially assumed. So let's say a federal branch agency made a regulation. This wasn't a law that Congress passed. Congress passed a broad sweeping piece of legislation. An executive branch agency said, okay, in order to enforce this, and appealing maybe to the necessary and proper clause, we're gonna promulgate these regulations. Well, now let's just say you run afoul of one of those regulations and you try to take them to court. The original Chevron decision said we have to assume that the federal agency got it right and met the intent. This new that overturned Chevron, was incredible. It was so necessary to say no. The courts are not going to automatically assume that bureaucrat number 4, who wrote this regulation. It just automatically fits with whatever Congress wrote. And I think you're right. And this is why I hope we have things like the REINS Act under, Senator Rand Paul and others, where we're going back to more like one issue per bill and the legislature once again assuming responsibility for their role in this process instead of delegating it out to the executive branch.
Yeah. And then, so I think from that, and going back to the question about censorship and everything else, to do this, these companies can either, remain protected by being a platform that, they're only removing content that clearly violates the law. They say, well, you go against our terms and conditions or community guidelines. But if you kind of dig in, they'll use very broad words such as harmful language, malinformation, terms that don't have a clear definition that allow for them to interpret, does this violate the policy or not? And so, basically you can go in and they can either operate, does this break a law? Yes or no. If it does not, then it remains on the platform, or they can continue to, operate as they do today, but it would give business owners and private citizens the right to sue them and to go after them because they're maybe infringing on their First Amendment rights. It was unfortunate because there were two cases one out of Florida, one out of Texas, where Governor DeSantis and Abbott were trying to kind of call this into question, saying these technology companies are infringing on our constituents' First Amendment rights, and calling into question, are they a publisher or a platform? And the courts did kick it back down. But even more so, I think it's concerning the Missouri decision, because the Missouri decision was kind of calling into question what we saw kind of come out of the Twitter files and everything else. And they basically said that the Biden administration can continue to persuade technology companies privately to side with their policy positions and to, potentially infringe on constitutionally protected rights.
Yeah, it's going to be, I always go back to John Adams' original quote about our Constitution is written for a moral and religious people and totally unsuited to any other. And another way to put that is that he was saying that basically if people don't have the capability of self-regulation, if they can't operate under reasonable boundaries and codes of conduct, then it's really, really difficult for the law to compel them to do so. And I feel like that's a large part of where we're at right now. It is so difficult to write the law just so to where you're getting to the thing you want and not hitting things that you don't want. And a large part of that is when companies behave unreasonably. And you look at Elon Musk. Elon Musk comes in, buys Twitter, turns it into X, fires 80% of the employees. And everyone's like, oh my gosh, it's never going to be able to operate. Well, now it's humming along just fine. And one of the things that you ask Elon Musk, he goes, it turns out when you're not sitting around, looking for excuses to censor people, you don't need, a fraction of the people that, or you only need a fraction of the people that they currently had running X. And I think that's such an important component of this. And that's the only thing that concerns me is that when we start messing with Section 230, if we're not very, very careful on how we do it, the left is going to use it as an opportunity to selectively go after people like Elon Musk. They are not going to bug the companies that are doing things the way they want it done. They're going to engage in lawfare against those companies that aren't doing it the way they want it done. Of course, you can make the argument they do that anyways. We might as well have some clearer lines with respect to what distinguishes between a platform and a publisher. Let me ask you this, kind of sticking on the technology side, because again, you're the co-founder, you're the CEO of Liberation Technology Services, and from everything I've read about you guys, one of the things you really focus on is this idea of being able to provide server packages and things like that, where I don't have to worry that, Google got pissed at me and now everything my company was relying on to run has just been taken away. And again, that's what happened. That is essentially what happened to Parler. And so I want to ask you this question. This has to go with kind of the vulnerability side. I think sometimes people need to chill out a little bit on we're terrified of technology. It's like, look, technology on the whole is I believe somewhat neutral. It's all about the hands that are using it and to what purpose, right? The same people that flip out about, we got to take away guns because some people use them inappropriately. And other people save lives, right? So what do you want? I kind of feel the same way about technology. But when all of a sudden, with one little update, hundreds if not thousands of flights are being canceled. People are not able to go into their jobs, ranging from everything from, hospitals to airports to everything in between. That does play into, I think, some very valid concerns about, this technological apparatus that we have become so dependent upon. And look, it enhances so much, right? It provides so much incredible capability. I don't want to just go into that whole black pill of burn it all down and let's go back to, just living on the farm, right? Fine if you want to do that, but I don't think we want everyone doing that. What do you, when we look at what happened with CrowdStrike, give us an idea, and I understand that, we didn't bring you on to do a deep dive in CrowdStrike. None of us knew it was going to happen before we had you scheduled. But, from your understanding, what do you see is going on with that? And what would you say are maybe some potential fixes or things people should consider when they're either setting something up for their business or they're just a little bit concerned about their own security and what they're dependent upon within their lives?
Yeah. So, from everything that I've read, everyone that I've spoken to, the CrowdStrike issue was essentially human error. They, from my understanding, got some dating schemes wrong and forgot that it's a leap year, and that threw everything off and caused at least part of the issue. But the CrowdStrike component, I think, speaks to a much larger issue, and that is that we've had a massive consolidation of technology providers as a whole. When there is not competition and alternatives in the market, you get a CrowdStrike where it can take down essentially a third, maybe even a half of the global IT and the Fortune 500 companies, causing massive outages and issues within, many parts of our day-to-day lives. But we also see that in the social media platforms, with there just being kind of the big three for a long time. Cloud providers and all those things. And that's exactly why we started Liberation, to serve as that alternative solution. And, we kind of take the literal position of being a platform where we do not, have those terms and conditions and loosely defined community guidelines and policies. And we just say, look, as long as you're not, selling drugs, trying to traffic kids and things like that, we don't care what you're doing. You can be left, right, up, down, run your business like you see fit, share your political ideals, because I think that, discussion helps make America, the country that it is today. But with that consolidation, you have technology companies that can change the narrative in a country, such as the Hunter Biden laptop story. It only took a few executives to say, hey, we're going to quash that. And something like 14% of surveyed Democrats in 2020 said if they would have heard about it, they wouldn't have voted for Joe Biden to begin with.
Yeah.
So that competition in the market not only serves as a redundancy, but also kind of a protection on our rights. It allows for real innovation and development. But at the end of the day, you also have to remember that technology is really just a tool. It comes down to who is wielding that tool. What are their intentions? We have this conversation, especially a lot around, AI. What is their ultimate intention? Is it to make it humanity a better place, or is it to make as much money and for them to control the narrative throughout the world? And so, it is a tool. We need to make sure that there's a lot of people wielding these tools so that, we can have great competition and the consumer ultimately can make their own informed decision about who they want to do business with.
So that's a good point. Let me point something out here, because this almost seems, I think, somewhat counterintuitive. I mean, I'm a free market guy, which means I love open competition. However, I also recognize that what it means is some people are going to lose, right? Some people are going to lose and companies are going to consolidate, and the companies that actually do the best job are usually the best at consolidating other companies under their wing. And then there's always this debate on like, okay, when do they become a monopoly? And here's what I've discovered on really looking at this throughout history. And I'll use the big monopoly that everyone used as kind of an example of why we needed antitrust law. That was Standard Oil, right? The thing is that the bigger Standard Oil became, the cheaper kerosene and oil got, right? They actually did a great job. The reason why they got so big and the reason why they had such control over the marketplace at some point was because customers loved what they were doing better than they loved what everybody else was doing. So I don't always buy into the narrative that companies got to be just instantly broken down by the government the soon they get to a certain size, in part because I've also seen the government use that as leverage. I've seen politicians use it as leverage to get campaign donations, right? Like, oh, you're getting pretty big and profitable, and I see you don't donate to politicians much. Be a shame if we had to have a hearing about antitrust laws concerning your industry, right? Crap like that. Here's my question. When I look at some of the companies that have done a good job of consolidating, I look for two things. Did they consolidate because people wanted to sell their businesses off to them because, quite frankly, they were so good at providing goods and services at affordable rates that you couldn't compete with them? that's a good form of consolidation in my mind. That's a company we want to grow. We want to flourish. We want to continue to do what they're doing because they do a good job of getting us, the customers, what we want. Then there's companies that get to a particular side and they immediately run to the government for subsidies, protections. They end up writing the laws that get passed in order to give themselves a competitive advantage within the marketplace. And then the other thing that they do is they are constantly suing new competitors to where essentially they just throw up their hands and say, fine, I'll sell because I can't beat you in court.
Yeah.
Right. Do you see any pathway forward where the government can once again fulfill what I think its role should be, which is not manipulating the marketplace in favor of certain companies or even certain like objectives that politicians have, but rather creating a free and open marketplace and maybe preventing some of the big guys from either, writing the legislation that would be inappropriate or from constantly using lawsuits as a way, lawfare as a way to destroy their competition?
Yeah, and I think that is a great question. And just like many things, there's kind of this balancing act that you have to, take when you're approaching everything. Because, to your point about Standard Oil, we also had, companies like Enron, where they kind of created this consolidation, but the foundation wasn't as sound as what many people thought. I think that it's one thing to be one of the best at what you do, and that's what we are ultimately trying to do is provide a great service and change the market as a whole, and hopefully can continue to grow for many years. But at the same time, when you're starting to undercut, corner competition into closing because you're able to use your size and weight to essentially take the legs out from the small guys, or crush them in just decades worth of lawsuits, that's when you have to start saying, look, your intentions are not to be the best in your section. Your intentions are to destroy everyone else in your industry. And at that point, the writing can be pretty clear.
Yeah.
Especially, when they start manipulating and taking over so many other adjacent industries to essentially create this bubble around the core product and service. And, no one can even compete with them because there's 3 or 4 degrees away from that product and service. And so it is a balancing act. And, I would never advocate for the government to just go in and file antitrust after antitrust law. But many ways, how the government finally went after Apple and saying that their, restrictions around their app store are, really antitrust in the approach. It consolidates a marketplace, and the fact that they are using the blue text versus green text, I think those are decent ways to exercise. And, let's also be honest, these conversations between the government and these companies, there are many conversations well before. There are warnings that these companies are given well before, and they can either adhere and kind of maybe change the way that they operate, or they can go down these predatory acts and continue to ignore. And then at that point, we do need a checks and balance system in place.
My threshold has always been this: the moment you're inappropriately using the law or you're using the government to cut out your competition, you're not a capitalist anymore, you're a cronyist. And I don't have sympathy for cronyists. Right. You go out on the open market, free market, and you compete, and you go straight Conan the Barbarian and conquer your enemies. And great. That's your business, because the only way you can really do that in the marketplace is if customers pick you over the competition. But the moment it's, I'm going to drag you through court because I can, or I'm better buddies with the politicians than you are. Again, you're a cronyist. You're not a capitalist. You're not a free market person. I just don't have any sympathy for you at that point. So I get that. Let me switch lanes here a little bit. We had talked a little bit about this idea of you serving in the White House and watching this progression as, big tech went from just kind of slamming the president because he wasn't their guy to censoring people in order to achieve a particular outcome, to this combination of feeling pressure from the Biden administration and from, I would say, the bureaucratic state, which is fundamentally left wing. I'm sorry, at this point, if you think that the bureaucratic state is neutral, you are not paying attention, right? It is fundamentally, left wing in its ideology, and that becomes very, very apparent in the way it conducts itself. So as we look at all of that, and we look at the potential of another Trump presidency, what do you think will be different between the last time, right? Because I've heard some people say, look, first time he was in office, he had the House, he had the Senate. Why didn't we deal with this stuff? Second time, he very well might not have the House and the Senate, right? I think he'll keep the House. We'll see what happens with the Senate. I think there's certainly a possibility for that. But in that case, what do you see happening with a second Trump administration if he doesn't have Congress to back him up on some of the things he wants to do with the administrative state?
Yeah, so I think that that's a great question. So there's kind of two things, and one very our lesser known fact is, and you hear this from many past presidents, for the first 2 years of your administration, you're really learning how to be president, how to govern. And it doesn't matter if you were a governor of a state or a Fortune 500 CEO, the job and the role and the duties of being president of the United States are unlike anything else. There's really no comparison that even comes close. So, what they say is for the first 2 years of your first term, you're kind of learning how this whole thing really operates. And by year 3, you're really starting to get a control on the legislative capabilities, the executive orders, and really understanding how to wield your administrative components. In this second Trump administration, you kind of negate that first 2 years of not really knowing how to operate. And I think that was kind of one of the biggest issues during the first term is, we had the House and Senate for only 2 years. And at the same time, we had folks inside the administration that were actively working against us, and a lot of uphill battles in addition to, the obvious learning curve. So I think going into a second term, you can see quick and immediate and decisive action. Not only does the president know what he's doing, the staff around him knows what they're doing, and Republicans, the middle and upper management that would go into these different departments and agencies, they better know what they're doing, because the last time that conservatives had worked in many of these agencies was 2008, and a lot had changed from 2008 to 2016.
Sure.
So, they would be able to go in and legislate effectively. Now, I would say I think that there's a pretty good chance that we can take both the House and the Senate. I think that the strong support for President Trump at the top of the ticket will carry a lot of those kind of toss-up states in both the House and in the Senate. And, from day one, they could effectively legislate. And I think that removing a lot of executive orders, shrinking the federal government, putting the career employees on a merit-based system, driving in, clear and effective legislation to solve many of these problems, and then letting the staff go in and start executing, getting the wall finished. They already know how to do that. They know what they can and they can't do. Going after the cartels that are pushing drugs, and especially fentanyl across the border. Our trade situation globally, stabilization of the U.S. dollar as the monetary standard. I mean, there's a lot of things that I think, a second term would, be able to accomplish, because it is really such a unique situation. So many people ask me, so who's going to win? What's going to happen? And I look at them and say, as a political, there's a lot of variables in this cycle that we've never seen in a presidential campaign, let alone all at the same time in the same cycle. This is really anyone's game. But I think, after the unfortunate events of last Saturday, that has more or less secured the Trump presidency for the next term. I think that too many Americans saw that and have seen what, the left narrative is doing, what the policies are doing to our day-to-day lives. And, that was a defining moment, a visual that no American can, really ignore anymore. And I think that's also one of the things that we've done differently since 2020. We're actually creating the visuals instead of talking to the statistics and the numbers.
Yeah.
We're playing the Democrats' playbook in that regard.
Well, and I was telling someone the other day, they're like, what do you think the Democrat strategy is going to be? I said, well, you're already seeing it unfold and you're already seeing it unravel at the same time. The unfolding was, we're going to generate excitement around Kamala Harris. We're going to show how excited everybody is about Kamala Harris. I said that's going to fail about 5 minutes after they start it. And then they are going to ramp up the vitriol against the right. And like, you thought it was bad before. You think Democrats are going to turn down the temperature now that all of a sudden somebody tried to assassinate Donald Trump, wounded two other people and murdered another? I said, you have not seen anything yet.
Yeah.
Because if they can't generate excitement about their candidate, they will try to generate hatred for yours. And that is exactly what they're about to do. And it's going to get ugly. And I'm really concerned for what happens, because look, I don't take anything for granted, and I think anybody that thinks this election is over right now it has spent 5 minutes actually analyzing politics. But I do think the wind's at his back. I do think the smart money is on Trump Vance ticket to win. And I don't know what happens the day after that. But I can tell you this. I think that if Trump Vance gets in there, I think there's going to be a couple of things right off the bat that they're going to immediately tackle. One is going to be the border. And it's so comical to listen to Democrats say, well, we tried to fix the border, but Republicans killed the issue because you'd rather have the issue than the solution. It's like, why did you need more resources, more authority, and more power to do what the last administration was already doing? And the answer is you didn't. You made it up. It's been a huge issue. It's been a catastrophe. Kamala has to own it. And I think Trump's going to laser focus on that very, very quickly. I think we're going to start to see a lot of stabilization. Once Trump is in office, I think you're going to see a lot of stabilization with respect to some of these conflicts, whether it be in Ukraine, whether it be in the Middle East, because Trump brought back the aspect of foreign policy, which I liked, which was using the U.S. military for punitive expeditions, not 20-year escapades and social theory on whether or not we can set up a parliamentary democracy in a place that's never had one, right? And so I don't think he's going to make those same mistakes. But I do think one of the core things, and I think in part, this is why he picked J.D. Vance. And I'd like to get because there was a lot of, look, Governor Youngkin's my governor here in Virginia. He was on the short list of people that could have been picked. Lee Stefanik, others, Tim Scott down in South Carolina, Doug Bergman over in North Dakota. There was all kinds of people that were being discussed. And you can look at each one of them and say, these guys would have been better for this, right? Like, okay, if you wanted to appeal to, a state that's purple that could potentially tip for you this year, maybe Glenn Youngkin could have produced that in Virginia, smart, savvy business guy. If you, Lee Stefanik, we could have gone through all the various reasons why various people would have been good VP picks. Here's my theory. You tell me whether or not you think I'm wrong. I think you picked J.D. Vance for two reasons, because you don't have to go back very far to realize that J.D. Vance was not always a Trump fan. But I don't think he picked him for that reason. I think he picked him because I think J.D. Vance, more than maybe any other senator with the exception of like Rand Paul, truly understands the threat of a massive unelected federal bureaucracy running the game. And for everything that Trump's going to have to do within a relatively short period of time, he needed somebody that he could put onto a particular issue, and somebody that I think he believes could be a successor. So that's my take. What's your take?
Yeah, I think that the Republican Party has a great problem, and that is the fact that we have a very deep, diverse, qualified bench compared to the Democrats, where you kind of look at it and, Gavin Newsom was at one point kind of the hot topic. And it's like, they're one of the worst economies, relatively speaking. You're seeing a state just in decline overall.
What's Gavin Newsom's in? I think Gavin Newsom's 20 years and $20 billion into his 10-year plan to solve homelessness.
That the express train system, there's project after project that the Newsom administration has failed, and they can't even deploy street sweepers to keep the crap off the sidewalks effectively. But, I think that, JD brings a unique kind of attributes. He's self-made, which, yes, there are other individuals that are on that list that are very qualified with their backgrounds. But I think he's young. He both comes from kind of that Trump hater, but also, America First ideology. So I think that he's able to toe a good line, because you have to think about, what happens in 4 years. We want to ensure that we have a strong presidential candidate, likely the individual that served as vice president. someone that can continue on the progress that we've made. Because if we hand it back over to the Democrats in 4 years, well, they can just unwind a lot of the progress that the Trump term and a second term would actually accomplish. So I think that he's got just a variety of great attributes, where he can come and relate to a lot of people as well. His age, his background, his understanding, but his understanding that there are real issues here and they need real answers. It's kind of funny because the Democrats, the Biden administration, Kamala, the borders they're like, oh, this is a border wall issue that the Trump or the Republicans are stopping. I've been to the border as of less than 6 months ago. The material is quite literally laying right by the wall. All they have to do is pick it up and drop it into the ground, and they could finish even more of the wall. It's sitting right there. They don't really have to buy anything new, but they elected to try to shove as many people through the border. But going back to them just being visceral about Trump and Vance, as we get into this, we've seen many of their approaches and strategies fail. The policy that the Democrats run on, they've just blown up in their face. Everyone knows that they're failing the American people. Joe Biden, was already a failed candidate, that they've had to boot him. They tried suing President Trump using the lawfare. My main concern, as one of the few cards that they have, obviously they've tried assassinating him. One of the few things that they have left is leveraging these technology companies. And that's why we're in this fight, because in 2022, we saw the Republican National Committee have their delivery rate drop to about 30%. Yeah. And that's because the Googles of the world and all these other types are like, we don't think that our users really want to hear from you. And that's a form of censorship in itself, because you're not able to show two sides of a story or create a conversation around the dinner table. And that's, really the problem, where, many of the constituents, the voters here in the United States, they only get one side of the narrative. And unfortunately, our education system has really told us that we need to believe that everything that's fed to us, and that's what we need to think, instead of being able to make our own informed decisions. So I think that it will be a very interesting, next 4 or 5 months for us.
So let me kind of let's talk about that a little bit more, because I think you're right. Now, again, when Elon Musk bought Twitter and turned it into X, I think that sent some shockwaves. Like I have noticed because we've got over 1 million followers on Instagram, we've got over 1 million subscribers on YouTube. And we talk about a lot of controversial stuff, right? We don't pull a lot of punches on the shows that we talk about, on the content that I put out there. And I've noticed that it seems to be going a lot better than it previously was. By the same token, when 2024 hit, and we were kind of officially in election season, we definitely noticed it on Meta platforms. Not so much on YouTube, but definitely noticed on Meta platforms, where the algorithm started pushing things. I'm looking at stuff in my feed. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like I've just liked or commented on these 6 other things, and then I do one little comment where I'm trolling somebody, and now that's all my feed. It's just left-wing stuff. I think Facebook has one of the worst algorithms I've ever operated with, and it's so bad it has to be intentional. That's one of the things. Again, I'm a big believer in, I don't chalk up to malice that which can be assigned to incompetence. But there's a certain level where you're looking and going, this is so incompetent, it has to be intentional, right? Yeah. Because nobody's this dumb and operating a system this complex or making this much money. So I definitely see problems with Meta. I've seen problems with Instagram too. They started putting in, and it was subtle, right? They would put in some sort of new feature and then change your preferences or make your preference a certain way on that feature in order to cut down political content you don't want to see. Well, who gets to decide that? Right? It's ultimately them. And that's all. Now that's all a little bit more in your face. The one that I think is even more nefarious, and this goes into kind of what you do now, right? The one that's more nefarious is it's the stuff in the back end, right? It's the stuff that makes the other stuff work. So you might say to yourself, well, fine. I hate what they're doing over on Meta, or I hate what they're doing over on one of these other social media platforms. I hate what they're doing on TikTok. So I'm going over to Truth. Well, if Truth Social doesn't have control over their servers, they go the way of Parler really quick the moment that. So explain a little bit about how important that infrastructure on the back end is important to making sure that you can that your company doesn't get taken down, or that you can operate on social media platforms that are not just going to be arbitrarily, snuffed out, not because the government necessarily came down and said anything, but because Google servers decided they didn't like you.
Yeah. And so that kind of goes back to everything, right? So we operate our own cloud out of our own infrastructure and everything else. And that's because that is the first building block on any technology stack. So if AWS or Google or Azure Cloud, which is Microsoft, they say, no, you violate our terms and conditions, if say Truth has, data and part of their site on one of those companies, they can just take them offline. They don't have to give you an excuse. You have no ability to kind of dispute it or, any way to right the situation. They'll just say, nope, you're done. And, what we're really seeing this year, and as you were kind of discussing, the reason that we're seeing kind of this stark contrast is because AI has been integrated into every part of these platforms. And it's not just your social media, it's your search, it's your email, it's your Microsoft documents and everything else. And this AI is trained by humans. It has the biases of its creators, which are oftentimes left of center, and they're able to go in and much more effectively search through emails, billions of emails a day, all these posts, and flag and remove, and also kind of pivot what information you're going to see, because ultimately these creators, these companies have a interest in Democrats winning and continuing on the support for a lot of their companies. And so, they want the Democrats to remain in control, and they'll use these platforms because there's no one really governing them to push people towards the left to voting for the Democratic Party. And, that is a very concerning thing, because you're only giving really one side. You're creating a echo chamber. And so, when there's an echo chamber, you might not realize that something is factually wrong. And, Dr. Epstein is a great guy who's done a lot of research on the Google algorithms and how they impact voting behaviors and everything else. He's predicting that, maybe up to 25 million Americans could change their vote just because they're subliminally targeted by many of these technology companies. One of the other things that we've seen is, say you're emailing, all of your listeners, and you have a phrase that Gmail doesn't like. Well, Gmail will just say, well, all of our folks won't receive it. It's not going to spam. We're just going to kind of make it go away into the internets, and you'll never be notified that you have an issue. They'll never know that you're trying to reach out to them. So technology really is being weaponized on every single level. And it's not just, these social media platforms. So you need to make sure that you're aligned with your values and the technologies you're doing business with.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Let me ask you one more thing on this point. Because when you have I mean, obviously when you sign on with a company, right, and you are paying them and you are the customer, there's these terms and conditions. And look, it's pages of legalese. Nobody really reads through them, or most people don't really read through them, right? Before they do this. But do you think that we're arriving at a point at any time where you're going to start to see more, let's say, class action lawsuits against some of these companies that where you could theoretically claim breach of contract, right? You provided me a platform. You said these services were going to be involved. You wrote your terms and conditions so vague that you essentially arbitrarily, or do you think they've written the terms and conditions well enough? Or do you think they just have so much money that they don't care? Like, what do you think it is?
So I think that if they get a hold of Section 230, because there's, terms in there that need to be reasonable, because these technology companies can update their terms and conditions every day if they want to, right? And they can be miles long. So is it reasonable to update it all the time, sneaking in little pieces of, legalese that give these platforms full ownership of all of your IP, everything that you're creating, your thoughts, your ideas. One could say that a reasonable court would say you're changing the contract too many times for a average everyday person to fully understand what you're forcing them to opt into.
Let me stop
Adobe,
you right. Let me stop you right there, because I get it, right? I get it, and we've seen stuff in Virginia. There was a bill a while back that typically it's something like on strong, like philosophical terms, I kind of had a problem with it because we were telling a private company what to do. But on practical terms, I loved the result, right? And it was a simple bill. Delegate Glenn Davis had it. And he said, look, if you allow someone to sign up for your website or your email list or whatever else it is online, you got to provide them a mechanism to unsubscribe online, right? It shouldn't be like, well, the only way you can unsubscribe is that if you send us a handwritten letter, written in the blood of a dodo bird, right? Like, and it was one of those things where it's like, gosh, this kind of violates the purest sense of freedom of contract, but it's become so manipulated that there's a real problem here. Here's my, and this goes into the heart of this, right? I don't like using the government to solve what should be contractual arrangements. However, like you said before, if you're so heavily dependent on a particular company for your technological infrastructure, you get to a point where it's like, I just got to put up with it. So the response to that in the marketplace is somebody comes up that doesn't do that to their customers and competes with them. How do you propose to compete with these guys over here? Is it just by providing a superior product that's not going to shut them down? Is it not by inundating them with constant upgrades of terms and conditions which don't make any sense? Like, how do you plan to do that? Because that's been the biggest question. And Elon Musk came to the conclusion that I'm not starting my own, I'm buying one of theirs, and I'm going to run it correctly. So how do you do that?
Yeah, so we've built our solution, our cloud, and all of our SaaS products with just common sense. We're not updating our terms and conditions all the time. We're providing an alternative. How do we do that? Well, it's by people, day-to-day business owners and individuals voting with their wallet, essentially saying, no, we want to support companies that are going to provide us, some just good core competencies. Our Hub for Teams is basically an alternative to Google Workplace or Microsoft Teams. So you've got video conferencing, file storage, email, all those kind of things. And we're just saying, we're not only going to offer you an alternative, we're going to try to make it a little bit better than what's already on the market, compete in classic capitalism. And, we believe that by actually delivering the emails to the people that you're trying to send it to, and you're getting a response, a higher response than another platform, you're going to put more money and you're going to tell your friends about the services that we're providing you. And that's how we grow ultimately. But at the same time, going back to kind of the lawsuit question, Adobe Photoshop just recently changed their terms and conditions. People that had already been signed up were automatically forced into it. And basically Adobe said, anything you create on our platform, we now own.
Yeah.
We can go and sell it again. You have no right. And to think that they're constantly updating everything, that's a major contractual change. And for them to not publicize it more than burying it in 80 pages and forcing you to hit accept before you can continue on with your work, one can make a strong argument there. But I think that at the end of the day, how we make a change in technology and in our country as a whole is really us, I guess, the individuals that think outside of the left's ideological box. If we vote with our ballots every 2 years, but you can vote with your feet every single day. You can also vote with your wallet every single day. We have seen a massive growth and success of all these, what people like to call parallel economy companies. And that's because so many Americans are fed up of having their data taken, being the product, being fed and force fed all of this kind of misinformation. And, finally, the capitalism and the capitalistic structure is finally starting to pay off. And I think that if, 100 million Americans start voting with their dollar, putting their money where their values lie and supporting these types of companies like ours, we can see a massive change in the marketplace in a few short years.
Well, and I want to make something very clear to our audience too. Like, we don't I've talked to Andrew. We don't have a deal with Liberation Technology
No.
Services on here or anything like this. So I'm not doing a promo, but I will say this. I think you're right. I think you're right about the nature of the problem. And again, as someone that believes that the free market is one of the best ways for consumers to, again, not only vote with their, a free country is not one where you just get to elect politicians every 2, 4, or 6 years. A free country is where you have the most control over your own life and your own decisions possible. And we have to start taking ownership of that when we actually go in and talk about the companies that we're going to do business with. But I appreciate you talking about your expertise on this, both from working with inside the White House, but also from the technology side, because so many people have become frustrated. And the danger I see is when frustration on the right turns into, well, the only thing that's going to solve this is more government power. And ultimately, that's not what we want. We want a freer market. We want a market where conservatives are not constantly put at a legal and regulatory disadvantage by the government. But in order to get there, we're going to have to elect the people that can actually put us in that posture. And that means fighting back legally and legislatively at this stage so that we can get to a freer portion. We're not looking for an opportunity to take over the system so now we can impose everything on you, because we're pretty confident in our ideas working in the marketplace when they're not being constantly hindered by lawfare and a bureaucratic state that is obviously ideological at this point. So, Andrew, thank you very much for coming on, for sharing your expertise. Tell people a little bit about where they can. I know you write articles for Epic at points. You do other stuff. Where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, so on social media, Liberation Technology Services or Liberation Tech. We're pretty unique in that regard, so you can find us, but you can also find us online at liberationtek.com.
All right. Well, Andrew, hey, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to everyone in our audience. We really appreciate you sticking with us, letting us know what sort of information, what sort of content that you'd like to see. Please consider going over to the Circle Chat, right? Because right over in there, in our community, our online community, that's where we get a lot of the ideas for what we talk about. So if you want to be a part of not just watching the show, but contributing to its future, please consider going over there to the community chat, signing up. Once again, Andrew, thank you for joining us. Thank you to our audience, and we will see you next episode.